Throughout history, every great empire has fallen victim to the same cycle that erases them from the stage of history. Rome, Britain, Spain, the most magnificent empires of history ruled with immense power. But they all collapsed in a similar fashion. The real destruction did not come from conquests, revolutions, or invasions. The real destruction comes from economic collapse, specifically the debasement of the currency. And this process proceeds in the exact same order every single time. Rome, the empire that ruled the world for 500 years, collapsed when its currency became worthless. Spain, despite holding the largest gold and silver reserves in history, went bankrupt repeatedly and ultimately reached the inevitable end. The empire collapsed. Britain dominated world trade for 2 centuries, but within 10 years of its currency failing, it lost its empire. Do you know that today, the world's global power and largest economy, the USA, is following a similar path? History has recorded the same cycle of economic destruction with 4 repetitions: military overextension, reckless spending, massive money printing and debasement, inflation, loss of confidence, and the inevitable end, collapse. And each time, the ruling leaders fell into the delusion of, we are not the same. We are different. Our empire is unique. Old rules do not apply to us. Every time, the inevitable result was the same: collapse. In the 21st century, the US is advancing step by step in this exact cycle, and all warning lights are flashing urgent red. The only question is, are we at the beginning, in the middle, or approaching the end? As the absolute authority of the world, Rome dominated Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East for 500 years. At its peak, it ruled 60 million people across 3 continents. Army had no equal. Its roads and cities were top tier. In terms of infrastructure, it was the best in the world. Rome's currency, the denarius, was used from Britain to Egypt. The denarius was a silver coin introduced in 211 BC, containing approximately 4.5 grams of pure silver. Its value remained unchanged for centuries because the government was careful to maintain purity and quality. When you received a denarius, you knew exactly what you were getting: pure silver, real value, and imperial trust. This trust allowed Rome to pay its armies, build infrastructure, and expand the empire's borders. But empires are very expensive. Borders expand from generation to generation, and every expansion requires far more soldiers, forts, roads, administration, services, and money. The Roman Empire did what every empire that spends more than it earns does. Falling into a great delusion, they found the solution in increasing money printing, and as a result, they debased the currency. Nero became the first emperor to reduce the silver content of the denarius. He needed to maintain his lavish lifestyle and strengthen his army for expensive campaigns. As a solution, he ordered the mints to reduce the silver content from 100% to 90%. This meant an extra 10% profit for the emperor. More coins in circulation with the same amount of silver. This is how inflation is created. But a 90% silver ratio was still significant. The real destruction came during the time of Caracalla. The denarius had fallen to 50% silver. Half of the denarius was real value, the other half was a piece of base metal. By 265 AD, under Gallienus, only 5% silver remained. While the denarius was once a coin of pure silver, it was now a 95% worthless metal with a thin silver coating. Let's talk about the gravity of this situation. Imagine yourself as a Roman soldier living in 265 AD. You just received your salary paid in denarius. But these coins are worth less than 1/20th of what soldiers earned 2 centuries ago. The money in your pocket has lost its meaning and its power. Strangely, the state insists that everything is fine. There is no crisis. You look at the money in your hand. It is still called a denarius. It still bears the face of the majestic emperor, but its purchasing power has been decimated. Inflation has exploded so much that a basic necessity you bought for 1 denarius in 200 AD costs 50 denarius by 300 AD. Naturally, the market has seized up. Farmers refuse to accept these worthless stamps for the wheat they produce, saying, "Don't give me money, let's barter." Soldiers refuse to fight, saying, "I won't lift a finger unless I get gold or tangible goods." Even tax collectors are helpless. The tin they collect has no meaning. In short, the economic gears of the great Rome have effectively rusted and stopped. Never forget this. This massive collapse happened neither because of a natural disaster nor because of a relentless attack from the outside. The killer was inside. The Roman government killed its own currency with its own hands. And the rule is simple. If an empire's money dies, the empire itself begins to die. When the calendar showed 476 AD and Western Rome officially collapsed, contrary to Popular belief, the reason was not the invincible power of the Germanic tribes. The real issue was that Rome had pulled the plug. It no longer had the strength to pay the army, run the bureaucracy, or even repair the roads. When money lost its meaning, the great civilization built upon it scattered like a house of cards. The cycle was brutal. First, they expanded uncontrollably militarily, then they spent wildly, saying, "We'll pay somehow." When the coffers emptied, they debased the currency to save the day, but this only accelerated the end. First, economic bankruptcy, then the inevitable dark finale, collapse. Okay, now let's take the plot and move 12 centuries forward to 1500 Spain. The scene is the Spanish Empire is at the peak of its power. Columbus has opened the New World. Men like Cortez and Pizarro have brought the Aztecs and Incas to their knees. Who holds the world's most valuable lands? Of course, Spain. Then comes the year 1545. The Spaniards find Cerro Rico in a place called Potosí in present-day Bolivia. This isn't just an ordinary silver mine. It is the largest silver deposit history has ever seen. I am not exaggerating. For the next 100 years, half of the world's silver comes from here. Fleets full of fortune pour across the Atlantic into the Spanish treasury. Naturally, the Spanish Empire reaches extreme wealth. The Spanish dollar becomes like the Bitcoin of that era, the first true global currency. Everyone from Europe to Asia uses it, because it is pure and backed by strength. Spain is the richest, most powerful in the world. But then what happens? Just like the Romans, they shoot themselves in the foot. Because money has a nasty habit. Having a lot of money in everyone's pocket doesn't make everyone rich. What happened when they drowned the market in silver? Prices skyrocketed. Something you bought for 1 silver in 1500, you couldn't buy for 10 silver in 1600. Silver is the same silver, but there is so much of it around that it has no value left. Inflation is experienced to the extreme. Worse still, Spain got used to easy money and produced nothing. Zero industry innovation is non-existent. They bury the incoming money either in palaces or in wars. Money enters Spain but doesn't stay. It flows out to England and the Netherlands, from whom they buy goods. By the late 1500s, kings are in debt up to their necks. King Philip II inherits a massive debt from his father but doesn't say, "Let me spend less." Instead, he borrows even more. He fights everyone at the same time. The result? The money runs out. In 1557, Philip comes out and says, "I am bankrupt. I am not paying the debts." This is the first sovereign default in modern history. But it doesn't stay there. They go bankrupt 3 more times in the next 40 years. Think about it, you hold the world's silver in your hands, but you cannot pay your debt. With every bankruptcy, trust dies a little more. When no one lends money, they debase the currency, mix in copper, but of course no one buys it. By the 1700s, nothing remains of that huge empire. Wealth melts away due to mismanagement. The scenario is actually always the same, it never fails. Find great wealth, spend recklessly, go into debt, inflation explodes, go bankrupt, and collapse. Spain showed us this very clearly. Even if your resources are unlimited, if you don't know how to manage money, you are doomed to sink. After the examples of Rome and Spain, we come to the British Empire, which spread over a much wider geography and managed a much greater wealth. When the empire reached its peak in 1922, it ruled a quarter of the world's population, that is 458 million people, and a quarter of the world's land. The phrase, "the empire on which the sun never sets," is not an exaggeration, it is an absolute fact. At the foundation of this global dominance lay the British sterling. For over 2 centuries, sterling was the undisputed reserve currency of the world. More than 60% of global trade was priced in sterling. £1 could always be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold. This mechanism provided trust, stability, and power in the global market. However, empires are built on credit, and these credits must be repaid. Britain constantly borrowed through government bonds to finance wars, colonies, and infrastructure. As long as sterling maintained its value, this system worked. But the First World War upset this balance. In 1914, Britain's national debt was at the level of £650 million. After 5 years of total war, in 1919, this figure soared to over £7 billion. A tenfold increase in just 5 years. To finance the war, the government borrowed from its own citizens and from anyone who would lend, including the USA. The cost of the war forced Britain off the gold standard. The government had to print money to cover war expenses, and it was impossible to maintain the gold backing while doing so. Sterling turned into a fiat currency backed not by gold anymore, but only by the government's promise. After the war, Britain tried to return to its former power. In 1925, the then Chancellor of the Exchequer Winston Churchill put Britain back on the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. This was an economic disaster. Because sterling became overvalued, British exports lost competitiveness and unemployment rose rapidly. The government maintained high interest rates to protect the value of the currency, which completely stalled economic growth. By 1931, Britain was forced to leave the gold standard permanently, and the value of sterling fell rapidly. The real economic destruction came with the Second World War. Britain entered the war already with a heavy debt burden. By 1945, the national debt had reached 270% of the gross domestic product, GDP. The empire had bankrupted itself to win the war. Cities were in ruins, the economy had collapsed, and the country had accumulated massive debts to the USA. In 1944, while the war was not yet over, the Bretton Woods Conference gathered to redesign the global financial system. The British sterling officially handed over the status of the world's primary reserve currency to the US dollar. Although Britain struggled to protect this status, they had neither gold reserves nor economic power left to back their currency. A long and humiliating decline followed this. In 1947, the government tried to make sterling convertible again, but this attempt lasted only 6 weeks as reserves ran out. In 1949, sterling suffered a devaluation of 30%. Another devaluation occurred in 1967. Every loss of value erased savings and destroyed global confidence. In this process, the empire also dissolved. India became independent in 1947. When Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956, Britain's military response resulted in failure. Colonies left one by one, not because they were invaded by foreign powers, but because Britain no longer had the power to finance them. By the 1970s, Britain was on the verge of economic bankruptcy. Inflation reached 25%, and the government had to apply to the IMF for a bailout package. Sterling, once the reserve currency of the world, was now a symbol of decline. The empire that ruled a quarter of the world had lost everything in just 30 years. This collapse happened not through a military defeat, but through a currency collapse and debt crisis. The historical cycle repeated itself here too: war, debt, debasement of currency, loss of reserve status, devaluation, inflation, and the collapse of the empire. The British example proved that when the currency collapses, even the strongest empire can fall within a single generation. Our historical journey brings us to the present, to the current superpower, the United States, and today's reserve currency. The picture is quite clear. All the crisis signals that destroyed Rome, Spain, and Britain are flashing red for the US right now. Let's start the analysis with the currency. The US dollar has been the world's reserve currency since the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement. This system made the dollar the global standard, and the dollar was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce. Since other countries pegged their currencies to the dollar was literally considered as good as gold. But just like in the Rome and Britain examples, the US started spending more than it produced. The Vietnam War, Great Society social programs, and global military expenditures strained the budget. By the 1960s, foreign governments realized that America was printing far more dollars than the gold reserves it held. Led by French leader Charles de Gaulle, countries began to hand over their dollars and demand physical gold in return. Gold reserves were melting, and the bluff was called. In 1971, President Nixon closed the gold window. The dollar no longer had gold backing. The dollar, just like the debased Roman coin or the post-1931 British sterling, turned into a fiat currency backed only by the state's promise and trust. At first, the system seemed to work. The petrodollar system, established in the 1970s, created an artificial demand for the dollar by mandating that global oil trade be conducted in dollars. However, spending never stopped. On the contrary, debt grew exponentially. Let's look at the data. In 1980, the U.S. national debt was $900 billion. In 2000, it rose to $5.6 trillion. In 2020, it exceeded $27 trillion. Today, that is in 2025, it is over $36 trillion. This means the debt has increased 40 times in 45 years, and the speed of increase is accelerating. But debt is only one side of the story. Just as Rome reduced the silver in money, or Spain flooded the market with silver, the U.S. is printing unbacked money. Since the 2008 crisis, the Federal Reserve, Fed, has created trillions of dollars out of thin air. They called this quantitative easing and argued it was necessary to stabilize the economy. During the COVID period alone, more than $4 trillion were printed in 2 years. This amount was more than the total money created in the previous century. And like every empire in history, they claimed this would not cause inflation. They said modern economics had surpassed the old rules, but they were wrong. Inflation reached 9% in 2022. However, the real inflation paid for basic needs like food, housing, and healthcare is much higher than this. The value of the dollar is being systematically debased. Although the process progresses slowly at first, the historical pattern always continues by accelerating. Just like in the British example, the US is facing the risk of losing its reserve currency status. In 2000, while more than 70% of global central bank reserves were dollars, today this rate has receded to 58% and the decline continues. BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and new members are building alternative systems to the dollar. They trade in local currencies and establish new payment networks to reduce dollar dependency. China and Russia are aggressively stocking gold. Central banks worldwide are diversifying their reserves. The market is preparing for the dollar to lose its dominance, just as it once prepared for the collapse of sterling. The historical template is very clear. The most dangerous dimension is military overextension. The US is experiencing the same problem Rome did. Today, the US maintains approximately 800 military bases in over 70 countries, and the annual defense budget is over $800 billion. The cost of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan exceeded $8 trillion. Running an empire is expensive business, and this system is currently funded entirely by debt and printed money. Just as Rome could not pay its soldiers with worthless coins, Spain could not fund its army due to bankruptcies, and Britain could not hold its colonies when its money collapsed. Time is running out for the United States too. Now, let's put this economic cycle that repeats itself throughout history into a clear framework. Because once you notice this template, your view of the world economy will permanently change. Every empire that has collapsed economically has followed the exact same path without exception. This is not just a simple similarity. It is the ruthless mathematics of history. The process always begins with the dominance phase. The empire is at the peak of its power. Military superiority is unquestioned. Its economy is unrivaled, and most importantly, trust in the currency is absolute. The Roman denarius, Spanish dollar, British sterling, and American dollar, they all lived this golden age. At this stage, the currency is backed by a real and tangible asset like gold or silver. From the outside, the empire looks invincible, power on which the sun never sets. However, this intoxication of power inevitably triggers the second stage, namely, overextension. The empire begins to spread over a much wider area than its resources, and logistics can sustain. More land, more military operations to finance, and bigger promises made to citizens. Costs climb to an unsustainable point. Rome spanned 3 continents. America today tries to finance hundreds of military bases on every continent of the world. When expenses exceed income, the third stage, the era of structural deficits, begins. The state spends much more than it earns. Initially, attempts are made to manage these deficits by borrowing. However, after a point, budget deficits cease to be a temporary crisis and become a permanent and structural part of the system, as we clearly see in the US example. Even while the economy grows, the state continues to run deficits of trillions of dollars. When debt limits are filled and taxes cannot be raised further, states choose the oldest and most dangerous path in history, debasing the currency. The empire cannot find enough debt, so it manipulates the money. Rome reduced the silver in the money. Britain abandoned the gold standard. The US completely severed the gold tie in 1971 and has been printing unbacked paper money since then. The result of this is a simple economic law, and the fifth stage, inflation, is inevitable. The equation is unerring. If the money supply in the market increases while the amount of goods and services produced remains the same, prices rise. Rome witnessed prices increase 50-fold. Britain experienced 25% inflation in the 1970s. America is currently right in the middle of this inflation spiral. At this point, the market realizes the facts, and the sixth stage, loss of confidence, begins. Both the local population and foreign allies lose their faith in the reserve currency. Whatever Roman soldiers demanding their salaries in gold instead of worthless denarius was in history, today world countries moving away from the dollar in trade and seeking alternatives is the same. Just as the world switched from sterling to dollar at Bretton Woods, now it is looking for ways out of the dollar. And the final act, collapse. The economic system goes bankrupt. The currency either becomes completely worthless or loses its global dominance. The empire, unable to finance its army, bureaucracy, and infrastructure, dissolves and loses control. Rome fell. Britain lost its empire. And the United States, the biggest question mark on the table right now is how this process will conclude. The pattern is this clear. 7 stages repeated 4 times over 2,000 years. Different empires, different continents, different technologies, but exactly the same sequence. Because the math does not change. You cannot spend more than you earn. You cannot print prosperity at a printing press. And you cannot debase your currency without paying the price. We are currently in stage 5 and rapidly moving towards stage 6. So what will happen next? History offers us 3 possible scenarios. The first possibility is the managed decline model we saw in post-1945 Britain. The empire is lost. Reserve currency status is forfeited. The country experiences painful devaluations and inflation. However, the nation-state does not perish. It just ceases to be a global superpower and continues as a second-tier power. It is a slow, humiliating, but survivable fall. The second possibility is the chaotic collapse experienced by 5th century Rome. It is the darkest scenario where money becomes completely worthless, the government loses authority, and the empire shatters. This is not just an economic crisis. It is a social, political, and systemic destruction. The third possibility is reset and restructuring. The bankruptcy of the current system is acknowledged. The old system dies, but a new currency, perhaps backed by gold, perhaps a new digital asset, is put in its place. The transition process is painful, but the system renews itself without completely collapsing. The United States is currently at a point of no return. The current debt burden has long exceeded the mathematically payable level. The options are clear: either default, hyperinflation, or a massive restructuring. Default ends the dollar's dominance instantly. Inflation is already happening and will accelerate. Restructuring requires a massive political will that currently does not exist. We have to emphasize a very vital difference here. Rome, Spain, and Britain were empires with regional spheres of influence. However, the US dollar is the foundation of the global system. When the Roman denarius collapsed, it affected Rome. But if the dollar collapses, the entire world shakes, from Tokyo to London, from trade agreements to pension funds. The interconnected nature of the global economy will multiply the severity and chaos of the crisis. Our analysis is based on historical data, not guesses. For great empires, for currency crises, and for identical results. The math of empires is emotionless. You can delay the process, you can deny it, but you cannot escape it. Rome debased money to pay its legions. The denarius died, the empire fell. Spain drowned, the world in silver. Inflation melted wealth, the empire declined. Britain drowned in debt with 2 world wars. Sterling collapsed, the empire dissolved. And now the US prints trillions of dollars, runs endless deficits, and says, "We are different." But economic laws do not recognize American exceptionalism. It does not care about your military power or technology. Wealth cannot be printed. Debt cannot last forever. And you cannot destroy the value of your currency without destroying your empire. The historical clock is ticking. The only unknown is the timing. When will the 6th stage be completed? When will the world completely lose its trust in the dollar? Data says the end is near, and history says this movie always ends the same way. The only variable is the speed of the collapse and the extent of the devastation it will create. The only question is the US next?